Claire pushed open the door of her apartment, her suitcase still in her hand, and the sound that greeted her was not the sound of an empty home. It was the sound of quiet laughter, low and familiar, coming from the kitchen. Her flight had landed 3 hours early. She had planned to surprise Daniel with a fresh bouquet of flowers and a bottle of wine, something to celebrate the fact that the wedding planner had finally confirmed their date. Instead, she stood frozen in the hallway, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears, because the second voice she heard was one she knew even better than her own. It was her younger sister, Megan. She told herself it meant nothing. Megan visited often. They were close, or at least they had always seemed close, ever since they were children sharing a bedroom and fighting over the same hairbrush. There was no reason for her stomach to twist the way it did. She set her suitcase down slowly, careful not to let the wheels click against the floor, and walked toward the kitchen with a strange, foreign fear rising in her chest, the kind of fear that comes from a place deeper than logic. What she saw when she turned the corner was something she would replay in her mind for months afterward, every detail sharp and merciless. Daniel stood with his back against the kitchen counter. Megan was close to him, closer than any explanation could soften, and their lips were pressed together in a kiss that was neither accidental nor brief. For a moment, Claire's mind refused to process what her eyes were showing her. She had spent 5 years building a life around this man. She had spent 29 years loving this woman as her sister. And here they were, together, in the one place Claire had always believed was safe. The sound that escaped her throat was not a scream. It was smaller than that, a broken gasp that made both of them turn at once. She watched the color drain from Daniel's face, watched Megan's hand fly to her own mouth as if she could physically take the moment back. Nobody moved for what felt like an eternity. Claire stood in the doorway of her own kitchen, in her own home, staring at two of the people she trusted most in the entire world. And she understood in that instant that her life had just split into two halves, a before and an after, and there was no bridge between them. "Claire," Daniel said, his voice cracking on her name, "this isn't what it looks like." She almost laughed. It was such a tired, empty thing to say, the kind of line she had heard in films and never imagined would be spoken to her, in her own kitchen, by the man she was supposed to marry. She looked at Megan, waiting for her sister to say something, anything, that might make sense of what she had just witnessed. But Megan only stood there, tears already sliding down her cheeks, saying nothing at all, and somehow that silence was worse than any explanation could have been. Claire did not remember deciding to leave. One moment she was standing in the kitchen doorway, and the next she was outside on the street, the cold evening air hitting her face, her suitcase forgotten inside the apartment. She did not have her coat. She did not have her phone charger. She had nothing but the clothes she had traveled in and a pain in her chest so sharp it felt physical, as though something inside her had been torn loose. She walked without direction for nearly 20 minutes before she realized her hands were shaking. She stopped at a small cafe on the corner of her street, the kind of place she had walked past 100 times without ever entering, and she sat down at a table by the window because her legs would no longer carry her any farther. A waiter approached and asked if she wanted anything. She could not answer him. She could only shake her head and stare at the table, replaying the image over and over, unable to make it feel real. It was there in that small cafe that she finally took out her phone and called the one person she knew would come, without asking too many questions. Her friend Laura picked up on the second ring, her voice bright and casual until she heard the sound of Claire's breathing on the other end, uneven and shallow, the unmistakable sound of someone trying not to fall apart in public. "Claire, what's wrong? Where are you?" Claire tried to speak, but the words would not come. She managed only a few broken phrases, enough for Laura to understand that something terrible had happened, enough for Laura to say she was on her way and to stay exactly where she was. Claire sat alone at that table for another 10 minutes, watching the street outside, half expecting to see Daniel come running after her, and feeling something close to despair when he did not. When Laura arrived, she slid into the seat across from Claire without a word, wrapping her scarf around Claire's shoulders because she could see her friend was shivering, though the cafe was warm. It was only after Laura ordered 2 cups of tea that Claire finally found her voice again, and even then the words came out broken and disjointed, as though she were trying to describe something her own mind still refused to accept. "I saw them," she whispered. "Daniel and Megan in the kitchen, they were kissing." Laura's face went through several expressions in quick succession, shock giving way to disbelief, disbelief giving way to something like anger on Claire's behalf. She reached across the table and took Claire's hand, holding it firmly, grounding her in the only way she knew how. "Are you sure?" Laura asked gently, though even as she said it, she seemed to know it was a foolish question. Nobody imagined something like that. Nobody mistook a stranger's embrace for the person they had shared a childhood bedroom with. Claire nodded slowly, staring down at the table. "I'm sure," she said. "I was gone for 3 hours less than I planned. 3 hours, Laura. If my flight had landed on time like it was supposed to, I never would have known." That thought alone was almost unbearable. The idea that she might have walked into her wedding, into a marriage, into a lifetime with Daniel, without ever discovering the truth that had apparently been hiding in plain sight. She thought of every dinner the 3 of them had shared together over the past few months, every evening Megan had come by just to talk, every text message Daniel had answered a little too quickly, a little too privately. Pieces she had never questioned before suddenly seemed to rearrange themselves into a pattern she did not want to see. Laura did not try to offer false comfort. She did not say that it might have been a mistake, or that there could be some innocent explanation, because she knew Claire well enough to know that false hope would only make the pain worse later. Instead, she simply stayed, ordering more tea, listening as Claire talked in circles, trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. "What do I do now?" Claire finally asked, her voice small and lost in a way Laura had never heard before. "Tonight," Laura said firmly, "you come stay with me. You don't go back there, not tonight. We can figure out everything else tomorrow." Claire nodded, grateful for the decision being made for her, because she did not trust her own judgment in that moment. Her mind kept circling back to the image of Daniel's hands, to the sound of Megan's voice mixed with his, and each time it did, the pain sharpened rather than dulled. She thought about her mother, who adored Daniel, who had already begun planning the seating arrangements for the wedding. She thought about her father, who had promised to walk her down the aisle in just a few months. She thought about the life she had imagined for herself, a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. As they left the cafe and walked toward Laura's car, Claire's phone began buzzing in her pocket. She looked down and saw Daniel's name flashing across the screen again and again, followed by a string of messages that she could not bring herself to read in full. She caught only fragments, words like "please" and "let me explain," and it meant nothing, words that felt hollow even in fragments. Beneath his messages, she noticed another name, one that made her chest tighten all over again. Megan. She did not open either conversation. She turned her phone face down in her palm and slid it into her bag, unwilling to let their words reach her, not that night. She needed distance, even if it was only physical distance, even if it did nothing to quiet the storm inside her. Laura's apartment was warm and familiar, a place Claire had visited many times before, though never under circumstances like these. Laura made up the guest bed without being asked, brought over a spare set of pajamas, and set a glass of water on the nightstand as though Claire were recovering from an illness. In many ways she was. Claire lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, unable to close her eyes without seeing the kitchen, without seeing them. She thought about calling her mother, but she could not bring herself to say the words aloud, not yet. She thought about calling her father, but she knew he would want to drive over immediately, and she did not have the strength to manage his reaction on top of her own. So she said nothing to anyone else that night. She simply lay in the darkness of Laura's guest room, feeling the shape of her old life crumbling around her, piece by piece, and wondering how she was supposed to build something new from the wreckage. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, exhaustion finally overtook her, and she drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, one filled with fragmented dreams she would not remember by morning. When she woke, the first thing she felt was a strange, disorienting calm, the kind that comes right before memory returns in full force. And then it did return, all at once, crashing over her exactly as it had the night before. She was no longer engaged in the sense she had imagined for the past 5 years. She was no longer certain of anything at all. She sat up slowly, her body aching in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion, and reached for her phone. 23 missed messages from Daniel. 11 from Megan. 2 missed calls from her mother, who clearly had already heard something, likely from Megan herself, though Claire could not know for certain what version of events had been shared. She set the phone down without reading any of it, walked into Laura's kitchen, and stood at the window for a long time, watching the early light spread over the rooftops of the city, wondering how everything could look so ordinary when her entire world had just been shattered overnight. Laura found her there a short while later, offering coffee and a quiet, steady presence that asked nothing of her. They did not speak much. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said the night before. Claire simply sipped her coffee and stared out at the street below, trying to imagine what her life would look like now, trying and failing to picture a version of the future that did not include the 2 people who had, until yesterday, been the closest to her heart. She had no idea in that quiet morning hour just how much more there was still to uncover, how much deeper the betrayal ran beneath the surface of that single kiss she had witnessed. She only knew that something inside her had changed permanently, and there was no way to return to the woman she had been the day before. The suitcase she had packed for a business trip still sat, untouched, in the hallway of an apartment she no longer felt safe calling home. And somewhere across the city, 2 people who had once meant everything to her were waiting, desperate and afraid, for the moment she would finally answer their calls. By the 3rd day, Claire had still not returned to the apartment she shared with Daniel. She had gone back only once, early in the morning while she knew he would be at work, to collect a bag of essentials, moving through the rooms like a stranger in a house that no longer felt like her own. She left the engagement ring on the kitchen counter, in the exact spot where she had found them, though she immediately regretted the symbolism of it and almost went back to remove it before deciding it did not matter anymore. Her mother, Helen, called for the 4th time that morning, and this time Claire finally answered, sitting on the edge of Laura's guest bed with the phone pressed hard against her ear. "Claire, sweetheart, please, we need to talk about this properly," Helen said, her voice tight with a strange mixture of concern and something that sounded almost like pleading. "Megan came to see me yesterday. She's devastated. She says it was a moment of weakness, that it happened once, that she never meant for it to go this far." Claire closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tightening in her chest. "It went far enough for me to walk in on it, Mom. That's already too far." I know," Helen said quickly. "And what she did was wrong, completely wrong, but she's still your sister. We're still a family. I just think, before anything is said or done that can't be undone, you should sit down and really talk to her." Claire wanted to ask her mother why the burden of forgiveness always seemed to fall on the person who had been hurt, why family loyalty so often meant asking the wounded party to swallow their pain for the sake of peace. But she did not have the strength for that conversation yet, not when the wound was still so raw it bled at the slightest touch. She told her mother she needed time, ended the call, and sat in silence for a long while afterward, staring at the wallpaper of Laura's guest room as though it might offer some kind of answer. Her father, George, called later that same evening, and his approach was entirely different from her mother's. He did not ask her to forgive anyone. He simply asked if she was safe, if she needed anything, and told her that whatever she decided, he would stand behind her completely. It was a small kindness, but it was one of the few things that week that did not feel like an additional weight pressed onto her shoulders. The family, it seemed, had already begun dividing itself into camps, though nobody had asked Claire which side she wanted them on. Her aunt sent a message suggesting that Claire should be the bigger person and consider counseling with Daniel, as though what she had witnessed was a simple misunderstanding rather than a betrayal by 2 people at once. A cousin she rarely spoke to messaged privately to say that Megan had always been jealous of Claire, that this had likely been building for a long time, and that Claire should trust her instincts rather than let the family talk her out of her own anger. Claire read every message twice, then set her phone aside, overwhelmed by how quickly her private pain had become a subject for public discussion among people who had not even witnessed it themselves. She began to understand, in those early days, that grief over a betrayal like this was not something she would be allowed to process quietly. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what she should feel, how quickly she should heal, and what she owed to the people who had hurt her. It was during this period, sitting alone one evening while Laura was at work, that Claire finally opened her laptop and began looking back through old messages, old photographs, old memories she had once treasured without question. She was not entirely sure what she was searching for. Perhaps she wanted evidence that what she had seen was truly an isolated incident, a single lapse in judgment that did not reflect years of hidden betrayal. Or perhaps some part of her already suspected the opposite, and she needed to confirm it before she could allow herself to fully let go. She began with her own photographs first, scrolling back through months of pictures from family dinners, birthday celebrations, quiet evenings at home. In several of them, she noticed things she had never paid attention to before. The way Megan always seemed to be seated beside Daniel rather than across from him. The way their eyes met in the background of photographs that were supposed to be of someone else entirely. None of it was obvious on its own, but taken together, a pattern began to take shape, one that made Claire's stomach turn with every new image she uncovered. She thought back to the past few months in particular, trying to recall each time Megan had visited the apartment. It had become so frequent that Claire had stopped questioning it entirely, simply grateful that her sister and her fiancé got along so well. Megan had come by after her breakup with her previous partner, tearful and needing comfort, and Claire remembered feeling relieved that Daniel was so willing to sit with her sister for hours, offering support while Claire worked late or ran errands. She had thought it was kindness. Now, she wondered how much of it had been something else entirely. She remembered evenings when she had come home to find the two of them laughing together in the kitchen, a private joke she was not part of, one they would explain away with a quick, dismissive comment before changing the subject. She remembered a weekend trip the three of them had taken together the previous spring, meant to be a relaxing getaway before the wedding planning truly began, and how she had spent an afternoon shopping alone while Daniel and Megan stayed behind at the cabin, claiming they wanted to rest. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. Now, each memory felt like a small betrayal she had somehow failed to notice while it was happening right in front of her. The following morning, Claire finally worked up the courage to call Megan directly, though she was not entirely sure what she hoped to accomplish by doing so. Perhaps she needed to hear her sister's voice, to search for some trace of the person she had once trusted completely, buried somewhere beneath the guilt. Megan answered almost immediately, as though she had been waiting by the phone for days. "Claire, thank you for calling. I've been so worried. I'm not calling because I forgive you," Claire interrupted, her voice steadier than she expected. "I need to understand what happened. How long has this been going on?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Claire began to fear the call had dropped. When Megan finally spoke again, her voice was quiet, careful, the voice of someone choosing her words with great caution. "It wasn't planned, Claire. I swear it wasn't planned. I was going through a hard time after my breakup, and Daniel was always so easy to talk to. It just sort of happened slowly over the past few months. I know that doesn't make it okay. I know I hurt you in the worst possible way, but please believe me when I say it wasn't something either of us set out to do." Claire felt a strange, hollow calm settle over her as she listened, the kind of calm that comes not from acceptance but from a numbness too deep for immediate anger. "A few months," she repeated slowly. "So this wasn't the first time." Another pause, heavier than the last. "No," Megan admitted finally, her voice breaking. "It wasn't the first time." The confirmation hit Claire harder than the discovery itself had somehow. She had spent 3 days telling herself that perhaps it truly had been a single, terrible mistake, a moment of weakness that did not reflect the deeper reality of her relationship with either of them. Hearing Megan admit that it had been going on for months shattered even that small, fragile hope, leaving Claire to sit with the full and complete truth of just how thoroughly she had been deceived, and for how long. "I need you to tell me everything," Claire said quietly, "every single detail." I deserve that much at least." Megan hesitated, and in that hesitation, Claire heard everything she needed to know about just how much there still was left to uncover. Secrets layered upon secrets, each one waiting to surface and cause her fresh pain. She realized, sitting there with the phone pressed against her ear, that this conversation was only the beginning of a much longer reckoning, one that would force her to confront not only what Daniel and Megan had done, but how completely she had trusted them both, and how blind that trust had made her to everything happening right in front of her eyes. Megan did not tell her everything that day. She promised to explain in person, insisting that some things were too difficult to say over the phone, and Claire agreed to meet her at a quiet park 2 days later, a neutral place far from any memory the three of them had shared together. In the time between that phone call and the meeting, Claire found herself unable to sit still, unable to focus on anything but the growing certainty that there was far more to uncover than either Daniel or Megan had yet admitted. She had never been the type of person to search through someone else's private messages. Even now, with everything that had happened, some part of her still resisted the idea, feeling as though it crossed a line she had always respected. But another part of her, the part that had been humiliated and deceived by two people she loved, told her that she had every right to understand the full truth of what had been happening behind her back. She thought of the shared laptop she and Daniel had used for years, the one that still had his email logged in from months earlier when she had helped him sort through wedding vendor invoices. She opened it late one night, her hands trembling slightly over the keyboard, and began searching, not entirely certain what she expected to find. It did not take long. Buried within an old folder of forwarded messages, she found a thread of email exchanges between Daniel and Megan that stretched back nearly 8 months, far longer than either of them had implied. The earliest messages were innocent enough on the surface, casual conversations about a film they had both wanted to see, jokes about their shared taste in music. But as the thread continued, the tone shifted gradually, the messages becoming longer, more personal, filled with the kind of intimate detail that had no place existing between a man and his fiancée's sister. She read through message after message, feeling something inside her grow colder with each passing paragraph. There were conversations about Megan's breakup, yes, but also conversations that had nothing to do with comfort or support. There were messages sent late at night, long after Claire had gone to sleep beside Daniel, conversations that continued for hours while she lay unaware just a few feet away. There were plans mentioned for meetings Claire had never known about, coffee dates disguised as errands, afternoons spent together while Claire believed Daniel was at work and Megan was visiting friends. The most painful discovery came near the end of the thread, in a message from Megan dated only a few weeks before the wedding invitations had gone out. In it, Megan admitted feeling guilty, describing herself as torn between her loyalty to her sister and feelings she could no longer deny. Daniel's response, rather than ending things immediately as any decent person would have done, had instead reassured her, telling her they would figure it out, telling her not to feel guilty for something that felt, in his words, so natural. Claire closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of Laura's guest room for a long time, unable to cry, unable to feel much of anything beyond a vast, empty shock. 8 months. 8 months of secret conversations, secret meetings, secret feelings that had grown and developed, while she planned a wedding with a man who had already begun building an entirely separate life with her own sister. She thought of every dress-fitting Megan had attended with her, every conversation about flowers and seating arrangements her sister had helped plan, all while carrying this secret the entire time. When she finally met Megan at the park 2 days later, Claire arrived early, wanting a few minutes alone to compose herself before the conversation began. She sat on a bench near a small pond, watching the water ripple gently in the afternoon breeze, trying to steady her breathing. When Megan arrived, she looked smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched, her eyes red and swollen from what appeared to be days of crying. Claire felt no sympathy stir within her, only a hard, cold resolve to finally hear the truth in full. "I read the messages," Claire said before Megan had even fully sat down. "All of them. 8 months, Megan, not a moment of weakness. 8 months of lying to my face. Megan's expression crumbled, and for a moment Claire almost thought she would simply walk away rather than face the conversation at all. But she stayed, sitting down slowly on the far end of the bench, keeping a careful distance between them. "I didn't know how to stop it," Megan finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I tried to end it, I told myself it was the last time, and then something would happen and we would talk again and it would start all over. I know that's not an excuse. I know there's nothing I can say that makes this better. But I need you to know that I never stopped feeling guilty, not for a single day." "Guilt doesn't undo 8 months of lying to me," Claire said, her voice sharper now, cutting through the calm she had tried so hard to maintain. "Guilt doesn't undo you sitting across from me at dinner, laughing with him, while this whole other relationship existed underneath everything. Do you understand what that feels like? Do you understand what it's like to realize the two people you trusted most were living an entire secret life right in front of you?" Megan did not answer immediately. She stared down at her hands, twisting them together in her lap, and when she finally spoke again, her voice trembled with something that sounded almost like desperation. "I was jealous of you, Claire. I know that sounds pathetic, but it's true. You always had everything figured out. Your career, your relationships, your confidence. I felt like I was constantly living in your shadow, and when Daniel started paying attention to me, really listening to me, it felt like something that was finally mine. I know how twisted that sounds. I know it doesn't justify anything. But that's the truth." Claire absorbed this confession in silence, feeling a strange mixture of anger and something close to pity, though the pity did little to soften the anger burning steadily beneath it. She had never realized her sister carried such deep resentment beneath the surface of their relationship, had never imagined that years of unspoken comparison had built into something capable of justifying, in Megan's own mind, a betrayal of this magnitude. "I need to ask you something," Claire said after a long pause, "and I need you to answer honestly because I already know most of the truth from the messages. Did you ever consider telling me yourself? At any point in the past 8 months, did you think about coming to me and admitting what was happening?" Megan's silence stretched long enough to answer the question on its own. "I thought about it," she finally admitted. "More times than I can count, but every time I was afraid of losing you completely. I told myself I would end things with Daniel quietly, and you would never have to know, and everything could go back to normal. I know now how foolish that was. I know I should have told you the moment it started before it went as far as it did." Claire stood up from the bench, feeling as though she could no longer sit still while absorbing everything her sister had just confessed. She walked a few steps toward the edge of the pond, staring out at the water, trying to organize the storm of emotions swirling within her. 8 months of secrecy. 8 months of choosing silence over honesty, deception over loyalty, in order to protect a relationship that should never have existed in the first place. "I don't know if I can forgive this," Claire said finally, without turning around. "Not now, maybe not ever. I need you to understand that whatever happens between us going forward, it's going to take a long time if it happens at all." "I understand," Megan said softly, though her voice broke on the words. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even think I deserve it. I just needed you to know the truth, all of it, even if it makes things worse before they get better." Claire did not respond. She simply stood at the edge of the pond for several more minutes, watching the light shift across the surface of the water, before finally turning and walking away without another word. She did not look back to see whether Megan remained on the bench or followed after her. She needed distance, real distance, the kind that could not be measured in mere footsteps, but in the slow, deliberate process of rebuilding trust that might never fully return. Later that evening, back at Laura's apartment, Claire finally allowed herself to cry, the tears she had held back for days finally breaking free all at once. Laura sat beside her on the couch, saying nothing, simply offering the quiet comfort of her presence while Claire processed the full weight of everything she had learned. It was not only the betrayal itself that hurt so deeply, though that alone would have been enough to shatter her. It was the realization that for 8 months, she had lived beside a lie so complete that she had never once suspected it, trusting completely in two people who had been deceiving her the entire time. She thought about the wedding dress hanging in a garment bag in a closet she could no longer bear to visit. She thought about the invitations already sent, the venue already booked. The future she had spent years imagining now collapsed entirely around a truth she never could have anticipated. And somewhere beneath the grief, a new feeling had begun to take shape, quiet but unmistakable, a resolve she had not expected to find so soon. She would not simply survive this. She would rebuild herself into someone who could never be deceived so completely again, someone whose trust, once broken this badly, would never again be given so freely. That night, as she finally drifted into sleep, her phone buzzed one final time on the nightstand beside her. She glanced at the screen without reaching for it, seeing Daniel's name appear once more, followed by a message she chose not to read until morning. Whatever he had to say, she was no longer certain she wanted to hear it. But some part of her, however small, knew that this was far from over, that the reckoning between them had barely even begun. The days that followed her conversation with Megan blurred together in a way Claire found difficult to describe to anyone who asked. She returned to work because she had no other choice, sitting through client meetings and design reviews with a hollow feeling behind her eyes, nodding along to conversations she barely registered. Her colleagues noticed the change in her almost immediately, though most were kind enough not to press for details. Only her closest coworker, a woman named Sophie who had become something of a friend over the years, dared to ask directly what had happened. Claire told her the truth briefly, without embellishment, watching Sophie's expression shift from confusion to horror as the pieces came together. Sophie did not offer platitudes or false comfort. She simply reached across the desk and squeezed Claire's hand, telling her that whatever she needed, whether it was time off or simply someone to sit with during lunch breaks, she would be there. It was a small kindness, but in a period defined by betrayal, small kindnesses had begun to feel like lifelines. Claire had still not read Daniel's messages in full. She had glanced at fragments of them over the past several days, enough to know that they continued to arrive daily, sometimes multiple times, filled with apologies and explanations she was not yet ready to absorb. Part of her wanted to block his number entirely, to remove herself completely from any further contact until she felt strong enough to face him. But another part of her, the part still tangled in 5 years of shared history, could not quite bring herself to sever the connection so completely, not yet. She began seeing a therapist during this period, a recommendation from Laura, who had seen the benefits of counseling during a difficult period in her own life years earlier. The therapist, a calm and patient woman named Grace, did not rush Claire through her grief or attempt to offer quick solutions. Instead, she simply listened, session after session, as Claire worked through the layers of betrayal she was still uncovering, helping her understand that her anger, her numbness, her occasional moments of unexpected calm were all normal parts of processing a trauma this significant. "You're allowed to grieve this relationship even while you're angry at the people who ended it," Grace told her during one particularly difficult session. "Grief and anger aren't opposites. They can exist together, especially when the loss involves someone you trusted as completely as you trusted your sister and your fiancé." Claire found those words strangely comforting, a permission slip of sorts to feel whatever she needed to feel without judging herself for the contradictions within her own emotions. Some mornings she woke feeling a fierce, protective anger toward herself, furious that she had missed the signs for so long. Other mornings she woke feeling only a deep, aching sadness, missing the version of her life that had felt so secure only weeks earlier, before everything had come apart. Her mother continued to call regularly, though the tone of her calls had shifted slightly since Claire had shared, in a difficult and painful conversation, the full extent of what she had discovered. Helen no longer urged reconciliation quite so forcefully, though Claire could tell the instinct remained just beneath the surface, tempered now by genuine shock at learning the affair had continued for the better part of a year. Megan, it seemed, had confided in their mother as well, though Claire suspected the version Megan shared had been softened considerably from the full truth Claire now carried. "I still don't know what to say to her," Helen admitted during one phone call, her voice heavy with an exhaustion that mirrored Claire's own. "I love you both so much, and I hate that I have to watch this happen to my own daughters." "I know, Mom," Claire said quietly, "but I can't fix this for you. I can barely hold myself together most days." It was during this fragile period, nearly 2 weeks after the initial discovery, that Daniel finally stopped sending text messages and instead appeared in person, standing outside the entrance of Claire's office building as she left work one evening. She spotted him from a distance, leaning against the brick wall near the entrance, his hands shoved into his coat pockets, his expression a mixture of anxiety and something that looked almost like desperation. Her first instinct was to turn around and go back inside, but she forced herself to keep walking, telling herself she owed him nothing, not even the courtesy of avoiding him. "Claire, please," he said as she approached, stepping forward before she could pass him by entirely. "Just give me 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." She stopped, though every instinct told her to keep walking, and looked at him properly for the first time since the discovery, noticing how tired he appeared, how the weeks apart seemed to have worn on him as well. She felt no satisfaction in his suffering. If anything, she felt only a distant, exhausted curiosity about what he could possibly have to say that might change anything at all. 5 minutes, she agreed finally, glancing at her watch, though she suspected this conversation would take far longer than either of them anticipated. They walked to a small bench near the edge of the office park, sitting at a careful distance from one another, the space between them feeling almost as vast as the betrayal itself. Daniel stared down at his hands for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice quieter and more uncertain than Claire remembered it ever being during their 5 years together. "I know there's nothing I can say that makes this okay," he began. "I know that. But I need you to understand that what happened with Megan, it was never about not loving you. I love you, Claire. I've loved you since the day we met. I don't know how to explain what happened without it sounding like an excuse, because I know that's exactly what it sounds like." Claire felt her jaw tighten, the familiar anger rising up within her once more. "Try anyway," she said flatly. "Because right now, all I know is that you spent 8 months lying to me while planning our wedding. I'd like to hear how you explain that away." Daniel flinched at the mention of the timeline, and Claire realized in that moment that he had not known. She possessed the full truth. She watched something shift in his expression, a flicker of panic beneath the practiced apology, and she understood with sudden clarity that whatever he had planned to say to her had been built on the assumption that she still believed this was a single, isolated mistake. 8 months, he repeated slowly, as though testing the number against whatever explanation he had prepared. "Claire, Don't," she interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut through whatever justification he had been about to offer. "Don't lie to me again. I've read the messages, Daniel, all of them. I know exactly how long this has been going on, and I know exactly how many times you told my sister not to feel guilty about it. So before you say another word, I need you to decide whether you're finally going to be honest with me, or whether you're going to keep pretending this was ever just a moment of weakness." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy between them, filled with everything neither of them had yet found the courage to say aloud. Daniel's hands trembled slightly where they rested on his knees, and for the first time since the discovery, Claire watched the careful mask of apology slip away entirely, revealing something closer to genuine fear beneath it. "I don't know how to explain it in a way that doesn't make me sound like a monster," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you deserve the truth, all of it, even if it's the last thing I ever get to give you." Claire sat perfectly still on the bench, bracing herself for whatever came next, aware that this conversation marked a turning point she could not yet fully understand. Whatever Daniel was about to confess, she knew it would either close the door on their relationship completely or open it just wide enough for one final, painful reckoning between them. Either way, she understood that she was no longer the same woman who had walked into that kitchen 2 weeks earlier, unaware and unsuspecting. She had changed, hardened in ways both painful and necessary, and whatever Daniel said next would only confirm just how far that transformation had already carried her. Daniel took a long breath before he finally began to speak, and Claire braced herself, uncertain whether she wanted the truth or whether some small part of her still hoped for an explanation that might somehow soften what she already knew. What he offered instead was neither comfort nor clarity, but a confession delivered in halting, uneven sentences, each one seeming to cost him something as he spoke it aloud. "It started small," he said, staring straight ahead rather than meeting her eyes. "Megan came to me after her breakup, upset, needing someone to talk to. You were working late so often during that period, and I felt like I was the only one available to listen. I told myself I was just being a good future brother-in-law, being supportive during a hard time. I know now how foolish that sounds." "Keep going," Claire said quietly, her voice giving nothing away. "The conversations kept happening," he continued. "Late at night over text and then in person when she would visit. I don't know exactly when it shifted from friendship into something else. I wish I could point to a single moment and say, that was when I should have stopped, that was when I crossed the line. But it wasn't like that. It was gradual, so gradual that by the time I realized how far things had gone, it felt impossible to go back." Claire listened, feeling a strange detachment settle over her, as though she were observing this conversation from somewhere outside her own body. She had expected excuses, had braced herself for justifications that would only anger her further. Instead, what she heard was something closer to a slow, reluctant unraveling of the truth, each sentence revealing a little more of the picture she had already partially assembled from the messages she had read. "There were moments I almost told you," Daniel admitted. "So many times I sat across from you at dinner and the words were right there and I couldn't make myself say them. I told myself it would destroy everything, the wedding, our families, and I convinced myself that ending things quietly with Megan would be enough, that you would never need to know, and everything could continue as though nothing had happened. So your plan," Claire said slowly, "was to marry me while carrying this secret for the rest of our lives together." Daniel's silence was answer enough, and Claire felt something cold settle over her chest, colder than the anger that had carried her through the past 2 weeks. It was one thing to imagine that Daniel and Megan had made a terrible, impulsive mistake. It was another thing entirely to understand that Daniel had planned, quite deliberately, to marry her while burying this betrayal so deeply that she would never uncover it. "I know how that sounds," he said quickly, sensing the shift in her expression. "But Claire, please, I need you to understand that none of it changes how I feel about you. I still want to marry you. I still want the life we planned together. What happened with Megan was a mistake, a terrible one, but it doesn't erase 5 years of love between us. I'm begging you, please, give me a chance to fix this. Give us a chance." Claire turned to look at him fully for the first time since the conversation began, studying his face as though searching for something she could no longer find there. She thought of the ring she had left on the kitchen counter, of the wedding dress still hanging untouched in her closet, of the future she had spent years imagining alongside this man. And she realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that the version of Daniel sitting beside her now was not someone she recognized, not truly, not anymore. "Do you understand what you're asking me to do?" she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging beneath it. "You're asking me to forgive not one betrayal, but months of calculated deception, carried out by 2 people I trusted more than anyone else in the world. You're asking me to marry you knowing that you were fully prepared to build our entire future on a foundation of lies." "I know it sounds impossible," Daniel said, his voice cracking with something that sounded like genuine desperation. "But people make mistakes, Claire, terrible mistakes. That doesn't mean they don't deserve a second chance. I love you. I've always loved you, even during the months when I was making the worst decisions of my life. Please, don't let this one chapter erase everything we built together." Claire felt tears building behind her eyes, not from any softening toward him, but from the sheer exhaustion of holding herself together through yet another difficult conversation. She thought of everything Grace, her therapist, had told her about grief and anger existing together, about allowing herself to feel whatever emerged without judgment. In this moment, What she felt most strongly was neither grief nor anger, but a profound and unshakable clarity. "I don't think you understand what you did," she said slowly. "You didn't make a single mistake, Daniel. You made hundreds of choices over 8 months, each one taking you further away from me and further into a relationship with my sister. Every time you chose to keep lying instead of telling the truth, that was a choice. Every time you reassured Megan instead of ending things, that was a choice. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a pattern sustained deliberately for the better part of a year." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Claire watched him search for something to say, some final argument that might change her mind, and found herself almost pitying the desperation in his expression, though the pity did nothing to soften her resolve. "I'm not saying this to punish you," she continued, her voice gentler now though no less firm. "I'm saying it because I need you to understand why I can't simply forgive this and move forward as though nothing happened. Even if I wanted to, even if some part of me still loves the person I thought you were, I don't think I could ever trust you again. Not after this. Not after learning how easily you were willing to deceive me for so long." "So that's it then," Daniel said quietly, his shoulders slumping in a way that suggested he had finally understood, at least partially, the depth of what he had lost. "There's nothing I can say that changes your mind." Claire considered the question carefully before answering, wanting to be honest with him even in this final, painful moment between them. "I don't know what the future holds," she admitted. "I don't know if there's ever a version of this where I can look at you again without remembering what I found in that kitchen. But I know that right now, today, I need you to accept that this relationship is over. Not because I don't still feel something for the person I thought you were, but because that person doesn't exist the way I believed he did." They sat together in silence for several long minutes after that, neither of them quite ready to stand and walk away from the conversation, though both understood there was little left to say. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said. "I know that probably means nothing now, but it's the truth. I got lost somewhere along the way, and I let my own weakness destroy the best thing that ever happened to me." Claire did not respond immediately. She thought of the 5 years they had shared together, the genuine happiness she had once felt in his presence, the future she had built in her mind around the promise of their marriage. All of it felt distant now, as though it belonged to someone else's memory rather than her own. She stood slowly from the bench, gathering her bag over her shoulder, preparing to walk away for what she suspected might be the final time. "I hope you figure out how to be honest with yourself," she said finally, "because clearly you weren't capable of being honest with me. I wish I could say I forgive you, but I don't think that's something I owe you, not after everything." She walked away without waiting for his response, her footsteps steady despite the storm of emotion still churning within her. She did not look back to see whether he remained on the bench, staring after her, or whether he too finally stood and walked in the opposite direction. She only knew that something had shifted permanently in that conversation, some final thread of hope she had not realized she was still holding onto, finally severed completely. That evening, back at Laura's apartment, Claire told her friend everything that had been said, recounting the conversation in careful detail while Laura listened without interruption. When she finished, Laura reached over and squeezed her hand gently, her expression a mixture of pride and sympathy. "You handled that better than I think I could have," Laura said quietly. "How do you feel?" Claire considered the question for a long moment before answering, surprised by her own response. "Relieved," she said finally. "Not happy, not healed, but relieved. Like I finally said everything I needed to say, and now I can start figuring out who I am without either of them." It was a small step, perhaps, in the long process of healing that still lay ahead of her, but it was a step nonetheless, one that Claire recognized, even in that difficult moment, as the beginning of something new. She did not yet know what her life would look like moving forward, what shape it would take without the wedding she had spent years planning or the sister she had once trusted completely. But for the first time since the discovery, she felt something other than devastation stirring within her, a quiet, fragile sense that perhaps, eventually, she would find her way through this after all. In the weeks that followed the conversation on the bench, Claire threw herself into the practical work of dismantling a life that no longer existed. She contacted the wedding venue first, her hands shaking as she explained to the coordinator, a kind woman who had helped plan dozens of weddings before, that the event would no longer be taking place. The coordinator did not ask for details, simply offering quiet condolences and information about the deposit refund policy, and Claire found herself grateful for the professional distance of the conversation, a small mercy in an otherwise overwhelming process. Next came the caterer, the florist, the photographer, each call requiring her to speak the same difficult words aloud, over and over, until the sentence, "The wedding has been cancelled," no longer felt quite as devastating to say as it had the first time. She kept a small notebook by her side throughout this process, checking off each vendor as she contacted them, treating the task with the same methodical focus she might apply to a difficult project at work, because focusing on logistics felt easier than sitting with the emotional weight of what those logistics represented. The invitations were the hardest part. Nearly 100 had already been sent, scattered among friends, family, and colleagues who had been eagerly anticipating the celebration. Claire drafted a short message explaining that the wedding would not be moving forward, deliberately vague about the reasons, unwilling to turn her private pain into public gossip for people she barely knew. She sent the message late one night, then closed her laptop and sat in silence for a long while afterward, feeling as though she had just formally announced the end of a chapter she had once believed would define the rest of her life. Word spread quickly regardless of her attempt at discretion, as word inevitably does within families and social circles. Within days, Claire began receiving messages from extended relatives and old friends, some offering genuine sympathy, others clearly fishing for details about what had actually happened. She responded to as few as possible, directing most inquiries to Laura, who had appointed herself an unofficial gatekeeper, deflecting questions with practiced ease so that Claire could focus on simply getting through each day. Her workplace, too, became a source of quiet tension during this period. Sophie remained a steady source of support, but Claire noticed the subtle shift in how others treated her, the careful, sympathetic glances from colleagues who had clearly heard some version of the story, the awkward silences when conversations turned toward weekend plans or upcoming events. She appreciated their discretion, even as it made her acutely aware of how much her personal life had become a topic of conversation beyond her control. It was during this difficult stretch that Daniel made one final attempt to reach her, an attempt that would ultimately mark the true turning point in Claire's journey toward closure. He arranged, through a mutual friend, to have flowers delivered to her office, an enormous arrangement accompanied by a card that read simply, "I still believe we can fix this. Please call me." Claire stared at the flowers for a long moment after they arrived, aware of her coworkers' curious glances from nearby desks, before finally picking up the arrangement and carrying it to the building's shared trash room, disposing of it without a second thought. The gesture, rather than softening her resolve as Daniel had likely intended, only solidified it further. She understood in that moment that he still believed grand gestures might undo the damage he had caused, that flowers and declarations of love could somehow erase 8 months of calculated deception. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of what she needed from him, and it confirmed, more clearly than any conversation could have, that he had not yet truly grasped the depth of what he had destroyed. 2 days later, he appeared at her apartment building, though she no longer lived there full-time, having moved most of her belongings into a small rented room while she searched for a permanent place of her own. He must have guessed she would return to collect the remaining items from what had once been their shared home, because he was waiting outside when she arrived with a rented van and 2 friends who had offered to help her move the last of her furniture. "Claire, please just talk to me," he said, stepping forward as she climbed out of the van. "I've been thinking about everything you said, and I understand now how much I hurt you. I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm asking you to let me prove that I can be better, that I can earn back your trust over time." Claire paused, studying him carefully, aware of her friends waiting nearby, giving her space to handle the conversation on her own terms. She felt none of the uncertainty that had colored their previous conversation on the bench. Instead, she felt a calm, settled clarity that surprised even her. "Daniel, I need you to hear me clearly because I don't think I'll have the energy to say this again," she said, her voice steady and firm. "This isn't about whether you can become a better person over time. Maybe you will. I hope you do, honestly, for your own sake. But that has nothing to do with me anymore. What you did wasn't a single failure I need to help you overcome. It was a sustained choice, repeated over and over, to deceive me while planning to marry me. No amount of time or effort changes that history. It happened. And I can't build a future with someone whose past includes that kind of betrayal, no matter how much he might change going forward." "So there's truly nothing I can do," Daniel said, his voice quiet, finally seeming to accept what Claire had been trying to communicate for weeks. "There's nothing you can do to change what already happened," Claire said. "What you can do now is let me move forward without constantly pulling me back into this. Every time you show up, every time you send flowers or messages, you're not proving that you've changed. You're proving that you still don't understand why this is over." Daniel stood silently for a long moment, and Claire watched something finally settle in his expression, a resigned acceptance that had been slowly building since their conversation on the bench weeks earlier. "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand. I won't come back again." "Thank you," Claire said simply, and then she turned back toward the van, where her friends waited patiently, and began the work of carrying the last of her belongings out of the apartment that had once been her home. Daniel did not follow her inside. When she emerged 20 minutes later with the final box, he was gone, and she felt, for the first time since the discovery weeks earlier, a genuine sense of finality settle over her, as though a door that had remained stubbornly ajar had finally been closed for good. That evening, as she unpacked boxes in her small rented room, Laura arrived with dinner, and the two friends sat together on the floor, surrounded by half-opened boxes, sharing a meal in comfortable silence. Claire found herself thinking not about Daniel or Megan, but about the small, quiet apartment around her, the modest beginning of a life entirely her own, one built without the shadow of the betrayal that had defined the previous weeks. "How does it feel?" Laura asked eventually, gesturing around the room. "Starting over, I mean." Claire considered the question carefully, surprised by how much clarity had settled into her thoughts over the past few days. "Terrifying," she admitted, "but also, strangely, a little bit exciting. I spent 5 years building a life around someone else's plans, someone else's future. This is the first time in a long time that I get to decide what comes next, entirely on my own terms." Laura smiled, reaching over to squeeze her friend's hand. "That sounds like the beginning of something good, even if it doesn't feel like it yet." Claire nodded slowly, looking around at the modest room that would serve as her home for the coming months, filled with boxes yet to be unpacked, and a future still largely undefined. She did not know exactly what came next, what shape her career or her relationships or her sense of self would eventually take. But she knew, with a certainty that had been slowly building since that painful conversation outside her old apartment, that whatever came next would be built on her own terms, free from the deception and betrayal that had nearly consumed her entirely. It was not healing, not yet, not fully. But it was, undeniably, a beginning. The following months passed slowly at first, each week marked by small, deliberate steps toward a life Claire was rebuilding almost entirely from scratch. She settled fully into her rented room, gradually making it feel less temporary and more like a genuine home, hanging pictures on the walls, arranging furniture to her own taste rather than compromising with someone else's preferences. There was something quietly powerful about those small decisions, choosing where a lamp should sit or which color to paint an accent wall, decisions that belonged entirely to her without negotiation or compromise. Her sessions with Grace continued weekly, and slowly, Claire began to notice genuine shifts in how she carried the weight of what had happened. Where once she had replayed the discovery in the kitchen almost daily, The memory gradually lost some of its sharpest edges, becoming something she could examine without immediately feeling the same visceral pain. Grace helped her understand that healing did not mean forgetting or even forgiving, but rather learning to hold the experience without letting it define every part of her identity going forward. "You're not the same person you were before this happened," Grace told her during one session, "and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You've learned things about trust, about boundaries, about your own resilience that you might never have discovered otherwise. The goal isn't to return to who you were. It's to become someone stronger, shaped by what you survived rather than broken by it." Claire held onto those words during the difficult moments that still arose unexpectedly, triggered by small things she could never have predicted. A couple laughing together in a coffee shop, a wedding announcement from a distant acquaintance, the smell of a particular candle that had once burned in the apartment she shared with Daniel. Each trigger brought a fresh wave of grief, though the waves grew gradually smaller and less frequent as the months passed, no longer capable of pulling her completely under the way they once had. Her relationship with her family remained complicated during this period, requiring careful navigation that Claire approached with a firmness she had not always possessed before the betrayal. She set clear boundaries with her mother, explaining that she needed space from conversations that pressured her toward reconciliation with either Daniel or Megan. And to her surprise, Helen eventually respected those boundaries, even if it took several difficult conversations to establish them fully. Her father remained a steady, uncomplicated source of support throughout, never pushing her in any particular direction, simply offering his presence whenever she needed it. Megan reached out periodically during these months, small messages checking in, asking how Claire was doing, never pushing for more contact than Claire was willing to offer. Claire rarely responded, and when she did, her replies remained brief and distant, though not unkind. She was not ready for reconciliation, and she was honest with herself about the uncertainty of whether that readiness would ever fully arrive. Some betrayals, she had come to understand, left scars too deep to fully erase, even with time and genuine remorse. Work became an unexpected source of stability during this period. Claire threw herself into projects with a focus and energy that surprised even her supervisors, channeling the restlessness she felt into her design work rather than allowing it to consume her entirely. She was assigned to lead a significant branding project for a new client, the kind of opportunity she might once have felt too overwhelmed to fully embrace, and she found herself rising to the challenge with a confidence that felt entirely new, forged in the difficult months since the betrayal. Sophie remained a constant presence throughout this period, and their friendship deepened considerably as Claire allowed herself to be more vulnerable with her colleague than she might have been in the past. They began meeting for lunch regularly, then for evening walks after work, gradually building a friendship that existed entirely outside the shadow of Claire's previous relationship. It was a small but meaningful reminder that her capacity for connection had not been destroyed by what Daniel and Megan had done, only tested in ways she had never anticipated. Laura, too, remained a steady anchor throughout the rebuilding process, though their friendship required no deliberate effort to strengthen, having already been solid long before the betrayal occurred. The two women spent countless evenings together over those months, sometimes talking through Claire's ongoing grief, other times simply enjoying each other's company without any mention of Daniel or Megan at all, a welcome reminder that Claire's life still contained joy and normalcy amid the difficulty. Around the 4th month after the discovery, Claire began exploring interests she had set aside during her years with Daniel, activities that had once brought her genuine happiness, before they had gradually faded from her schedule in favor of shared plans and compromises. She rejoined a pottery class she had abandoned years earlier, finding unexpected peace in the quiet, methodical work of shaping clay on the wheel. She began running again. Something she had once enjoyed regularly before her mornings became consumed with wedding planning and shared routines that left little room for solitary pursuits. These small returns to her former self felt significant in ways that surprised her, each one a quiet reclamation of an identity she had gradually surrendered piece by piece over the course of her relationship with Daniel, often without even realizing it was happening. She began to understand, through these rediscoveries, just how much of herself she had unconsciously set aside in an effort to build a shared life that, in the end, had been built on a foundation far less stable than she ever could have imagined. By the 6th month, Claire noticed a genuine shift in how she moved through the world, a lightness that had been entirely absent during the difficult early weeks after the discovery. She still thought about Daniel and Megan occasionally, still felt flashes of anger or sadness when certain memories surfaced unexpectedly. But these moments no longer defined her days the way they once had. She had begun, slowly and deliberately, to build a life that felt entirely her own, one where her happiness no longer depended on the presence or absence of the two people who had once meant everything to her. She celebrated this progress quietly one evening, sitting alone in her apartment after a long day at work, looking around at the space she had built entirely for herself over the past several months. The walls were covered with art she had chosen, the shelves filled with books she had always meant to read, the small kitchen stocked with ingredients for recipes she had never had the time or energy to attempt during her years with Daniel. It was not a large apartment, nor a particularly luxurious one, but it was entirely hers, built without compromise, without deception, without anyone else's needs taking precedence over her own. She thought in that quiet moment about how far she had traveled since the night she had walked into her old kitchen and discovered a truth that had shattered everything she believed about her life. She was not the same woman who had fled that apartment in shock and disbelief. She had become someone stronger, someone who understood the value of trust and the importance of choosing, carefully and deliberately, who deserved to hold that trust going forward. It had been a painful journey, one she would not have chosen for herself, but she recognized, sitting alone in her own space that evening, that she had emerged from it changed in ways that felt, against all odds, genuinely positive. The road ahead remained uncertain in many ways. She did not know what her relationship with Megan would eventually become, if anything at all. She did not know whether she would ever fully release the anger she still carried toward Daniel, or whether some smaller version of that anger would remain with her indefinitely, a permanent reminder of what she had survived. But for the first time in many months, these uncertainties no longer felt threatening. They felt, instead, like open questions belonging to a future she was finally ready to build entirely on her own terms, whatever shape that future eventually took. Nearly a year had passed since the night Claire discovered Daniel and Megan together in her kitchen, and the woman who now walked through the city streets on a bright autumn afternoon bore little resemblance to the shattered figure who had once fled that apartment with nothing but the clothes on her back. She had been promoted at work several months earlier, taking on a leadership role that allowed her to mentor junior designers, a responsibility she approached with a confidence that continued to surprise her whenever she paused to notice it. She had moved once more during that year, this time into a proper apartment of her own choosing, larger than her original rented room but still entirely reflective of her own taste, free from any lingering compromise or shared history. Sophie had helped her decorate it, the two women spending an entire weekend arranging furniture and hanging art, laughing over shared memories that had nothing to do with heartbreak or betrayal, everything to do with the simple pleasure of building something new together as friends. It was through Sophie, in fact, that Claire had recently been introduced to Peter, a soft-spoken architect who worked on a project alongside Claire's design team. Their introduction had been entirely casual, a brief conversation during a shared coffee break that had gradually evolved into occasional lunches, then evening walks, then something that Claire found herself hesitant to name too quickly, wary of moving too fast after everything she had endured the previous year. Peter never pushed for more than she was ready to give, seeming to understand instinctively that her trust needed to be earned slowly, through consistent honesty rather than grand gestures or hurried promises. She had not told him the full story of Daniel and Megan right away, though she eventually shared it during a quiet evening several months into their growing friendship, watching carefully for his reaction. half expecting the same discomfort or pity she had grown accustomed to seeing in others. Instead, Peter had simply listened, asking thoughtful questions, offering no judgment, and afterward telling her simply that he admired the strength it must have taken to rebuild her life so completely on her own terms. It was a small moment, but one that reassured Claire she was finally beginning to trust again, carefully and deliberately, with someone who seemed to genuinely deserve that trust. News of Daniel and Megan reached her occasionally through the family grapevine, despite her efforts to distance herself from that particular chapter of her life. She learned, through a brief and awkward conversation with her mother, that their relationship had continued for several months after Claire's departure, though it had ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own troubled beginning. Apparently, the guilt and suspicion that had colored their relationship from its earliest days had never fully faded, each of them unable to trust the other completely, given the circumstances under which their relationship had begun. Claire felt no satisfaction upon hearing this news, only a distant, almost clinical sense of confirmation that betrayals built on such fragile foundations rarely produced anything lasting or genuinely happy. Megan had reached out again around the 10-month mark, requesting a meeting that Claire had initially been reluctant to accept. She agreed eventually, curious about her own capacity for forgiveness after so much time had passed, and the conversation that followed was markedly different from their painful exchange in the park nearly a year earlier. Megan appeared genuinely changed, having spent months in her own therapy processing the choices that had led to such devastating consequences, and while Claire remained cautious about fully rebuilding their relationship, she found herself willing, for the first time, to consider the possibility of a distant, careful reconciliation somewhere in the future, built slowly, and without any illusion that the past could simply be forgotten. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were," Megan had told her during that conversation, her eyes red but her voice steadier than Claire remembered it being in the park. "I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I took from you, and I'll spend as long as it takes trying to earn back even a small piece of your trust, if you're ever willing to let me." Claire had not offered any promises that day, unwilling to commit to a timeline for healing that she could not yet fully predict. But she had agreed to occasional contact, small steps forward that felt manageable rather than overwhelming, a cautious first bridge across the vast distance that had grown between them over the past year. It was not forgiveness, not entirely, but it was something, a small crack of light in a relationship that had once felt permanently and irrevocably broken. As for Daniel, Claire had not spoken to him since the day he came to her old apartment building nearly a year earlier. She had heard, through mutual acquaintances, that he had moved to a different city for work shortly after his relationship with Megan ended, seemingly eager to escape the wreckage of choices that had cost him not only his engagement, but also his standing within a family that had once welcomed him completely. Claire felt little beyond a distant, muted curiosity about his life now, the intense emotions that had once consumed her having faded into something closer to indifference, the natural result of genuine healing rather than suppressed pain. On this particular autumn afternoon, walking through the city with Peter beside her, discussing plans for an upcoming weekend trip they had been looking forward to for weeks, Claire found herself reflecting on just how far she had traveled since that devastating night in her old kitchen. She thought about the version of herself who had sat frozen in a small cafe, unable to speak, unable to process the betrayal unfolding around her. That woman felt like someone from another lifetime now, distant and unfamiliar, though Claire recognized the strength that woman had carried even in her darkest moments, strength that had ultimately carried her through to this new, hard-won peace. She did not regret the pain she had endured, strange as that realization felt whenever it surfaced. The betrayal had cost her enormously, stripping away a future she had once believed was certain, forcing her to rebuild her entire sense of self from the ground up. But it had also taught her invaluable lessons about resilience, about the importance of choosing carefully who deserved her trust, about her own remarkable capacity to survive devastation and emerge, eventually, into something stronger and more genuinely herself than she had ever been before. As she and Peter turned onto a quiet street lined with autumn trees, their conversation drifting easily between work plans and weekend excitement, Claire felt something settle within her that she recognized, after so many difficult months, as genuine contentment. She had not simply survived the worst betrayal of her life. She had built something entirely new from its wreckage, a life defined not by what had been taken from her, but by everything she had chosen, deliberately and courageously, to build in its place. And as she walked forward into the golden afternoon light beside someone who had earned her trust through patience, rather than demanded it through desperation, Claire understood with quiet certainty that she was finally, truly, moving forward into a future entirely her own. 2 more years passed, and the life Claire had built for herself continued to grow in directions she could never have predicted during those first devastating weeks after the discovery. Her career had flourished beyond anything she imagined possible, her design studio now carrying her name alongside 2 former colleagues who had joined her in launching an independent firm, a risk she never would have taken during her years with Daniel, when stability had always mattered more than ambition. The studio had grown steadily, earning a reputation for thoughtful, distinctive work that reflected the confidence Claire had rebuilt piece by piece since the betrayal that once threatened to define her entirely. Her relationship with Peter had deepened into something steady and genuine, built on years of consistent honesty rather than grand gestures or hurried promises. He had proposed the previous spring, not with elaborate spectacle, but during a quiet evening at home, presenting the question with the same patient sincerity that had characterized their entire relationship from the beginning. Claire had said yes without hesitation, surprising herself with how completely different this engagement felt compared to the one she had left behind, built as it was on years of demonstrated trust rather than assumptions she had never thought to question. Their wedding, still several months away, was being planned with a lightness Claire had not expected to feel again, free from the anxious perfectionism that had colored her previous engagement. She found herself laughing during venue visits rather than stressing over details, trusting Peter completely in decisions both large and small, a trust that felt earned rather than simply assumed. Sophie had agreed to serve as her maid of honor, thrilled by the invitation, and Laura had already begun planning an elaborate celebration for the engagement party, determined to mark this new chapter with the joy Claire so thoroughly deserved. Her relationship with Megan had also continued its slow, careful evolution over these 2 years, built through small, consistent efforts on both sides rather than any single dramatic reconciliation. They had begun meeting occasionally for coffee, tentative at first, gradually growing more comfortable as trust rebuilt itself in small increments. Megan had continued her own therapy throughout this period, and Claire could see genuine growth in her sister, a deeper self-awareness that had not existed before the events that shattered their relationship. Claire had not forgotten what happened, and she suspected she never fully would, but she had found a way to hold both the memory of that betrayal and a cautious, evolving relationship with her sister simultaneously, without one canceling out the possibility of the other. It was at a family gathering marking their mother's 60th birthday that Claire finally felt something shift completely within her regarding the entire ordeal. The extended family had gathered at her parents' home, filling the house with laughter and conversation in a way that reminded Claire of childhood celebrations long before any of the difficulties of the past few years had entered their lives. Megan arrived alone, having remained single since her relationship with Daniel ended, focusing instead on her own healing and personal growth in the years since. The 2 sisters found themselves alone together briefly in the kitchen, an echo of sorts to the space where everything had once fallen apart so completely, though this kitchen belonged to their parents rather than carrying any of the painful history of Claire's old apartment. Megan was helping arrange food onto serving platters when Claire joined her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, simply working alongside one another in a silence that felt, for the first time in years, genuinely comfortable rather than strained. "I saw the venue photos Mom showed everyone," Megan finally said, glancing up with a small, hopeful smile. "It looks beautiful, Claire. Peter seems wonderful." "He is," Claire said simply, feeling none of the old tension that had once colored every conversation between them. "I'm happy, Megan. Genuinely happy, in a way I wasn't sure I would ever feel again after everything." Megan's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly, clearly trying to maintain composure. "I'm so glad," she said quietly. "You deserve that happiness more than anyone I know. I think about what happened almost every day, and I know saying that probably doesn't mean much at this point, but I want you to know that I've never stopped being grateful for every small piece of trust you've been willing to rebuild with me, even after everything I did." Claire set down the platter she had been arranging and looked at her sister carefully, recognizing in her expression the same guilt and hope that had characterized so many of their conversations over the past several years. She thought about how far they had both traveled since that painful afternoon in the park, when the full truth of the betrayal had first come pouring out between them. Neither of them was the same person who had sat on that bench, Claire consumed by devastation, Megan drowning in shame. Time and effort had transformed them both, slowly and carefully, into people capable of standing in this kitchen together without the weight of that history crushing everything between them. "I want you at my wedding," Claire said finally, the words surprising even herself as she spoke them aloud. "Not in the wedding party, not yet, maybe not ever, and I need you to understand that this isn't the same as saying everything is completely healed between us. But I want my sister there, watching me marry someone who actually deserves my trust. I think that would mean something for both of us." Megan's tears finally spilled over, and she reached out carefully, as though unsure whether the gesture would be welcomed, wrapping her arms around Claire in a hug that neither of them had shared in years. Claire allowed the embrace, feeling something loosen within her chest that had remained tightly wounded since that terrible night so long ago. It was not complete forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever entirely. But it was progress, genuine and hard one, built through years of patient effort rather than granted freely or too quickly. "Thank you," Megan whispered against her shoulder. "I promise I won't take this for granted." Later that evening, as the family gathering wound down and guests began departing into the cool evening air, Claire found herself standing on her parents' porch beside Peter, watching the last of the autumn light fade over the familiar street where she had grown up. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, feeling the steady warmth of his presence, so different from the anxious uncertainty that had once characterized her relationship with Daniel. "You seem lighter tonight," Peter observed quietly, studying her face in the fading light. Claire considered his words for a long moment before responding, reflecting on everything the day had brought, the small but meaningful reconciliation with Megan, the quiet joy of watching her family gather without the shadow of old betrayals hanging over every conversation. "I think I finally let go of something I've been holding onto for a long time," she said finally. "Not the memory, not entirely, but the weight of it maybe. The anger that used to sit right beneath the surface of everything." Peter smiled and pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, saying nothing further, understanding instinctively that some moments required no additional words. Claire looked out at the quiet street, thinking about the woman she had been on that terrible night years earlier, frozen in a doorway, watching her entire future collapse in an instant. She thought about the long, difficult journey that had carried her from that moment of devastation to this quiet porch, standing beside a man who had earned every ounce of her trust, surrounded by a family slowly healing from wounds that had once seemed impossible to overcome. She understood now, with a clarity that had taken years to develop, that the worst moment of her life had not destroyed her, however completely it had once felt capable of doing so. It had instead become the beginning of a longer, more difficult journey toward becoming someone stronger, someone more discerning about who deserved her trust, someone capable of building genuine happiness even after experiencing devastating betrayal. The path had not been easy, and there remained pieces of that old pain she suspected would never fully disappear, quiet scars she would carry for the rest of her life. But standing there in the gentle evening light, surrounded by people who had earned their place in her life through patience, honesty, and genuine effort, Claire finally understood that she had not simply survived what happened to her. She had transformed it into the foundation of a life far richer, and more authentically her own, than anything she could have imagined on that devastating night when everything first fell apart.